And the points she's raising here are really, really important. And I think we do have to take time to give her a lot of credit for presenting this, because ultimately there is a sense from my perspective of confirmation bias, right? We do need to sit back and maybe fact check a lot of this stuff, and not take it at face value. And it works both ways, right? If you have a different view, I would suggest you take that same challenge, right? You know, for me, it explains what I'm observing quite well. It hangs together. It's a coherent narrative that makes a lot of sense. But ultimately, correlation isn't causation, right? You know, we can't be too conspiratorial about what we're seeing here. But I think the points she's raising are excellent simply because it forces us to think very carefully about this and what is going on. And it challenges the things, you know, it asks the right questions ultimately. But that is the way to take a lot of this. These are not things that you have to take as ultimate truths, but these are certainly things that you do have to question and come to your own conclusions. And I think she's done an excellent job here. So I do want to take the time to give her credit for that. Okay, so we're going to do something a little bit different here. So we're going to be reacting to a reaction by Young Don. So this is a YouTuber that I find pretty entertaining. And this is a reaction to his reaction on a video by Vanessa Wingard, who's covering the plight of home ownership in the US and the impact billionaires are having on that, and the prospects around whether or not home ownership is a realistic dream. So really interesting video. I would recommend watching the original video by Vanessa Wingard, as well as also the reaction that I'm reacting to here. I'll leave links in the comments below. And yeah, let's see what we can learn.
Billionaires want us homeless. Video by Vanessa Wingard.
I'm going with Vanessa Wingard. Yeah, hopefully we're not butchering the name there.
I don't even know. It even got a weird A on it, bro. What the fuck is this? Dutch? I don't know. No offense, Vanessa. Shout out to Vanessa. Let's check this out. Billionaires want us homeless, man. What's going on?
Y'all, so why I go to my leasing office today to renew my lease, and they was telling me how my rent is going to increase by like $600.
Yup.
Ever wonder how much it costs to live in a camper? It's not as cheap as you might think.
And I do love this house. I
Wow.
love everything about
That's
this house.
where we are, huh?
I've come to the realization that I can't stay here because I can't afford to.
You know, I live full time in an
Fuck.
RV, and we're trying to get a new RV, and they're just super expensive.
Call it a mobile home, call it a
Yeah.
trailer, but either way, we're buying one.
People are buying storage sheds from Home Depot and converting
This
them.
is where we are. This is where we are. People are looking up on YouTube how much to live in an RV. What is it like living in an RV? Where can I park my RV when I'm living?
I mean, these all sound like AI prompts as well, actually. So it's interesting that people are looking on YouTube, and it makes sense in some ways. And I think there are a lot of financial advisors that are actually advocating against home ownership and arguing it's a con for whatever reason. And maybe we'll learn more as to why that is. But that does actually feel like something you would give to a generalized AI if such a thing ever comes into existence, and ask that to solve the problem, maybe.
In my RV. These are actual YouTube searches, I'm sure, being searched by the thousands every day.
Into homes. The billionaires have already bought those too.
I just got our rent renewal, and it's going up by $300 a month. $300 for a one-bedroom apartment that is not updated in any sort of way.
Yeah, at this point, you're better off signing multiple year leases. That's the only.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that would actually work. So in the UK, if you were to try and sign a multi-year lease, they would still up the rent anyway. So they'll just break the lease. They would just not honor the contract. So contracts are binding, but in order to do that, you've got to go to court, and who can actually do that? And then by the time it's all said and done, it's just easier just finding somewhere else to live if that's possible, or paying the increased rent. So a multi-year deal will not actually protect you in most cases, unfortunately.
only way to guarantee it's not gonna go up by fucking $500 every fucking year, dude. Like, you gotta sign 3-year leases at this point. That's the only way you can have some degree of predictability.
Yeah, and that would only work if you live outside the major cities. So if you live inside the major cities, you're definitely not going to get any protection for a multi-year contract, as far as I'm concerned, or a multi-year tenancy. It's just not going to happen.
Any apartment.
22.6 million renters in the US are now cost burdened, meaning they're spending more than 30% of their income just on housing and utilities.
Yeah.
People are
I mean, that's crazy, like the fact that it's that high. I mean, well, it's not crazy. I mean, it's understood that most people are sort of working to, tread water financially, it seems. But I think for me, the issue here is that, we haven't even factored into that taxes. And these will be things like council taxes in the UK. In the US, they have property taxes. And it's something I talked about when I covered the budget in the UK, where the Chancellor was congratulating herself for keeping inflation low and saying that she'd brought the cost of living down, whilst at the same time hiking taxes, or at least increasing taxes on landlords, which we'll come on to later on, because you might think that's a good thing. Mansion taxes, which is just an extra tax on houses in the UK on top of the council taxes. And also indirect taxes on interest and reduction to tax reliefs on pensions. So all in all, there were a lot of indirect tax increases, which offset any gains in terms of reducing inflation, which actually was a debatable point, and was shown actually by some measures not to have been reduced. So overall, the situation makes it very, very difficult if you are renting or paying a mortgage. If 30-40% of your net income is going towards that, how do you save? How do you prepare yourself, for a pension? It's a very, very difficult thing to do.
working 40, 50 hours a week, but half their paycheck is gone before they've even bought groceries, gas, or had any fun. So naturally, people start thinking, why am I paying someone else's mortgage? I should just buy a house. And that's where the next trap lies. The median single-family home hit over $400,000 in 2024. Wow. That's 5 times the median household income. To afford the monthly mortgage payment on that home, you need to earn at least $126,000 a year. Out of the 46 million people who rent in the US, only 6 million of those people make that amount of money each year. That means mathematically, 87% of renters will never own a home.
Again,
yeah, and I think something to bear in mind as well, actually, before we hear from Don, is that, in the UK at least, and certainly a lot of billionaires, which we're sort of looking at here as well, have been arguing and worried about the fact that young people don't want to have children. So if 80%, 87% of people are not in a situation where they can even think about owning a home, and they don't have any security around how much rent they're going to be paying year on year on year, and your salaries are not increasing in line with this, and taxes are just going up on workers, then this doesn't create an environment that encourages having children. So this is something, again, I find very strange, that on the one hand, we're not, helping workers by alleviating these problems, but at the same time, certain parts of the population are complaining that, the indigenous people of their land are not having kids. They're losing their culture, they're losing their identity, but are not prepared to do anything about it from a socialist perspective in terms of some of the things that can be done. So, yeah.
Recall that video we reacted to not too long ago for the baby boomers. When they were around 27 years old, half of them owned a home by the age of 27, bro.
Exactly. So if you think about that, if at 27, you own a home and you have security. So even if you're renting, if you have security and peace of mind, this encourages thinking about having children if that's an ambition you have. at a good age, right, where you're relatively mature but still young enough and have the energy to raise kids, and then at the end of that have some kind of life after the fact. You know, they've grown up and fled the nest. So you know, we're not in that predicament anymore. And most people, when they get to a point where they can own a home, they're relying on both people working. You can't have one person working and the other person, you know, staying at home. You know, even if that's something you want to do, you may not want to do that. And also typically, you know, the average age is, you know, closer to 30, 40, which again, when you think about having children, at that point, you might be resigned to the fact that actually I don't have that desire anymore and I'm quite happy living the life I'm living. So, yeah.
Baby boomer generation. Now, 87% of people who rent homes cannot literally financially cannot afford to buy one. Not the average home.
So I was just out on a walk right now, and check out these homes next to this path that I'm on. I was looking.
I mean, the thing looks soulless there. It looks absolutely dead. Like, I would not feel like there's any sense of community. And it's typical of these new developments where it literally looks like it's just been dropped from the sky. There's no schools that I can see, obviously. There's no history, there's no, you know, character, you know, where are the roads leading to this place? You know, there's no infrastructure around this, you know, where, you know, if there's a church, is there a church there? A museum? Like, there's just literally nothing. And then I think this is what you find often. And then, you know, it's sort of like you're waiting for all of these things to slowly arrive and build out over time. So yeah, this doesn't look very appealing, and just everything's just a sea of grey there. So it's almost just camouflaged with the landscape and the background. Not great.
Looking these homes up on Zillow.
Yeah.
And you're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 615, 625, 650 for these really tiny houses.
Right.
I mean, they're not very big. You can see the properties they're sitting on.
And the irony is, look at all the land surrounding the houses. They could have made those houses bigger. It's not like there's any constraints in terms of available land. So it's almost like a sick joke, what you're observing there, actually, in terms of the sizes of the house and how clustered they are. They're literally clustered in the middle of this massive space.
They're tiny, and yet people want $650,000.
Yeah, insane.
For these homes at what, 6.25% interest rates?
Yeah.
Like, no wonder nobody can afford anything.
According to NBC, in Q2 of 2025, investors bought 1/3 of all.
Bro, you have to understand, this is all artificial. Like, literally nothing is stopping the government from making it so that we could build homes more easily, like opening up the land. There is nothing stopping the government from doing that.
There is political pressure, though, and it's something Young Don actually talked about in another video about baby boomers. So politically, there isn't an appetite to do anything that threatens the appreciation of home prices. So, and again, it's mainly because many people in the UK, certainly most of their wealth, if they're an ordinary person rather than an ultra wealthy person, is tied up in their home. And many of these people will vote, as we all do, in their own interests. So any party that allows a housing price correction, so to speak, or a housing crash, is going to find themselves struggling to be re-elected in the subsequent term. So there is at least that pressure. And then the other point, which he's also raised, which is equally valid, is that a lot of wealthy individuals have parked excess capital and extra cash, so to speak, spare cash they have basically, in real estate as well, because it's seen as a very safe and predictable inflow of cash going forward. It's a safe asset. So because homes are treated as assets and commodities rather than resources and essential resources that we actually need to survive and that are conducive to a functioning society, we're in a situation where we're incentivized, you know, to maintain that small elite group by keeping the housing bubble going. So it will never really be allowed to pop, so to speak, or burst. And that is actually why, I think that is pushing against anything that will then correct for this and actually allow people to get into a situation where houses are more affordable going forward.
We could build housing more efficiently, more effectively. We could literally cut the pricing of housing by half. These big corporations, they don't want to do that. The billionaire class, the Epstein class, they don't want to do that. A lot of their wealth is tied up in real estate. And so if they can artificially keep the prices of homes high by flooding the nation with immigrants and preventing us from building new homes for these immigrants and for just anybody else that's here. I'm an immigrant, by the way. That's not a shot at an immigrant. I'm just saying this is they're creating an artificial scarcity here.
And he's right, because many things can be true at once. So as I mentioned before, we're in a situation where many people in Western economies do not want to have children. The population is aging. I've alluded to the fact as to some reasons why people may not feel like they want to bring children into the world when, they're struggling to make ends meet themselves. So, we're in a situation ultimately whereby, thinking about buying a house or having a house is very, very problematic. So the main thing you could do is actually build more housing. That's actually what you could do. Because you can't really bring the cost of these things down because there's always this demand that's driving it up because houses are scarce, relatively speaking. So you could just build more houses. You could regulate housing as well. So, not too long ago, in my parents' generation, the government's had a large stock of council housing, public housing, which again, they could then offer to people who needed that support. So there wasn't this need for them as the government to think about the only reason we want to do this is to extract as much profit as possible. So they had a completely different agenda to private equity investors and private individuals, private business people, whose function ultimately is to maximize profit. That's what capitalism is. So we just have to view houses very, very differently. The government does need to step in my view, and regulate it and treat it for what it actually is, which is an essential resource. I'm philosophically against the idea of an essential, scarce resource that we all need to have dignity in life being treated as a commodity, which is subject to the whims of the free market.
Single family homes sold.
And then the houses that they're building now are fucking dog shit. They're fucking dog shit. The way how.
And anecdotally, that's true. I've certainly, been made aware of the fact that many people that have bought new homes, certainly in the UK, the quality of those homes, the build quality is pretty poor. There's always a lot of issues. And also the warranties for these homes are very, very short. So they tend to be about 10 years or so, which when you think about something that is meant to last, many lifetimes, a warranty of 10 years doesn't give you the greatest amount of confidence. So yeah, they are cutting a lot of corners because, as I say, the idea is to reduce your costs as much as possible. And that will be reflected in labor as well, which comes back to the point around immigration and economic migrants and how they can be leveraged, as well as the fact that they're going to sell it as high as they can because they know it's a scarce resource. So they are in a position where they can extract as much money out of would-be homeowners as possible.
They build these houses these days.
1/3 of homes in a 3-month period. And now they're not just buying homes, they're building entire neighborhoods that you can never own. These are called built-to-rent communities.
Yeah, another grey block of just houses in the middle of nowhere. It reminds me of the scene in Arrested Development. I can't remember the main character. The Bluths, I think, is what they're called. Michael Bluth, that's it. So Michael Bluth basically sets off to build this settlement basically in the middle of the desert. And it looks very much like this. And everything in this settlement is a facade. The house is a facade. It's made very, very cheaply. All the props in the house are facades. They're not real. and he's just camping there waiting for people to arrive and buy houses. And this actually is what this looks like. This is what this scene looks like here. And again, it's very perverse because it's made very, very clear what the intention is. It's like, you will own nothing. You will rent, and you will keep renting until you can't afford to rent, and then you move on and we'll find someone else. So the idea of ownership is becoming more and more of a luxury rather than an expectation. And we're seeing this model reflected in all sorts of services and all sorts of things. So this is why the idea of wealth taxes becomes more prevalent in my own mind, actually, because when you have this approach where basically every asset is being hoarded, and the only way you can access the benefits of those assets is to essentially rent them back from those that are hoarding it, which is basically what we're seeing here. It feels unfair, right? It doesn't feel like this is what capitalism and business should be about, right? A healthy economy should see a flow of money and a flow of assets. That's what should be happening. And we're not seeing that. What we're seeing is a concentration and therefore a leveraging, which means that we're in a position where you must rent because it's an essential asset. And because there's a monopoly forming, they can basically put that rent up as high as they like, knowing you have nowhere else to go.
They look like your average subdivision, houses, driveway.
They don't look like average houses. Average houses have character. This just looks like, I don't know how to explain it, but it just looks soulless. It looks dead.
Backyards, but every single home is rental only. Built to rent now accounts for 9% of all new single-family construction in the US. Companies like Tricon, which is part of Blackstone's real estate portfolio, are building these in Texas, Arizona, South Carolina. Look at this. A 4-bedroom, 2.5 bath, 1,900 square feet in Texas with fees comes out to $2,911 a month.
That's crazy.
They've got the cheap vinyl flooring, bathroom tile from the early 2000s, and a backyard the size of a shoebox.
Jeez.
All for the low price of $3,000 a month. Their idea of solving the housing crisis is you will never own a house. You will rent a house instead of an apartment, but each year they'll still increase your rent.
Yeah.
Well, I can't afford my house anymore. My mortgage.
And look, I'm not even married to this idea that buying a house needs to be a milestone that everyone achieves. That's just like.
And I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. I think the idea of home ownership is being foisted upon people because it's seen as an obvious way of basically increasing wealth. And it is a valid way of doing so. But I think what many people want, again, this is anecdotal, there's no evidence behind what I'm going to say here, is they just want security. And actually, even in my own mind, I'd be very comfortable renting somewhere indefinitely because I don't have this strong desire to own properties or own my home. I just want security, and I just want to be in a situation where I'm not struggling or worried about what I'm going to be spending just to live. But the only way to get that peace of mind is to either buy your home outright or to get a mortgage and agree a fixed term, or even if you're doing a tracker, at least it's on your own terms so that you can budget and feel comfortable about doing other things like going on holiday, saving, investing. Like, you need that stable foundation, which is being taken away from people with this new dynamic we're seeing and observing here. So for me, it just feels like something that it's a massive burden. If you didn't have to do it, it would free up a lot of money to do a lot of other different things. You could go traveling, you could invest more aggressively, even if you want to be more sensible. You can set up your own business and invest in yourself rather than borrowing from the bank because, again, you've got that free cash. There's a lot you can do, and you can move easily, right? So if you're not happy with the property that you're in, and again, if we're in a healthy market for rental properties where there's lots of options, this is kind of where you want to get to, and it's cheaper than owning, then that will naturally bring the house prices down because, again, there's not this sort of desperation to own a house just to, fix your outgoings. And also people will be more, will be in a better position to say, actually, this house isn't up to code. I want to move somewhere else. So there's a lot of freedom if you could have rental properties that were available and there was legislation in place to enable rent control. And I think that is something that does exist in Germany, for example. I believe it exists in some Scandinavian countries. I can't remember which one. I think Denmark is the one I'm thinking of, for example, where again, there may be regulation around this. And again, many of the landlords are not happy about it. And, you know, you can't please everybody. But I think on balance, when we're considering the fact that this is an essential resource, and in my view, philosophically, it should not be treated as a commodity or security, then I think it's reasonable. And I think that that is the direction I would personally want to see.
A cultural thing. It's just too fucking expensive. Like I don't think people would mind if you didn't actually own the home you lived in, if everyone was paying like, you know, a quarter or a fifth of what we're now currently paying for rent.
And this is the crazy thing. He's right, because it's become so normalized that housing is expensive. But think about what a house is. It's just somewhere to live, right? So when I was growing up, you know, everybody could think about having a house, and your house could be terrible. It could be like not very nice, or it could be really nice, you know, and the nicer your house was a reflection of your success or your luck, right? If you were born into wealth, which is okay, it's not your fault. But what I'm saying is everybody could have a house. And the only distinction was how good was your house. And it was the same with things like a car as well. Everybody could have a car, that maybe your car wasn't so great compared to, you know, your neighbor's car, because again, maybe, you know, they earned a little bit more. So for me, we've moved away from that now, where, you know, there's this very sort of binary situation where you have or you have nothing, and there's no in between. And I think for me that dynamic is not sustainable, because there's just not enough, you know, high paying jobs. You know, think about that figure she showed, where, you know, you'd have to earn over $120,000 a year to basically be in a situation where you know, you could afford a median valued property of 400,000 or so. You know, how many jobs are paying that kind of salary? You know, there will be jobs that pay that salary, but can everybody expect that? Even if they're working hard, even if they're offering a lot of value to society, can they expect a salary of that amount? And even, and perversely, even if they could, what you'd find is, because housing is so scarce, because not enough houses are being built, it will actually just drive up the prices of rent and houses anyway. So it will always move away from your earnings, because the more you earn, chances are the more everybody else is earning. It creates more competition, so therefore more demand, and therefore the bubble just keeps inflating. And this is why regulation, in my view, is important to counteract that.
Or for, you know, it would actually give us more mobility, more freedom with our money. But it's the fact that your rent is also so fucking astronomically high, bro. Like, that's literally all of your paycheck. You pay your rent, you pay your health insurance, you pay your car insurance, and now you're fucked. Now you have nothing.
Went up. When I first purchased this house, it was $169,000.
I mean, look at this guy's face. That, I think that sums up everything. That just apathy and just fed up. You know, you think about midlife crisis. You know, and I'm not trying to be rude about this guy, but, you know, if you've got grey hairs, you know, receding hairline, it would suggest, you know, you're sort of approaching that midlife point. You know, so it's not me being rude. It's just, you know, just what I'm reasonably guessing, I think. And yeah, I think many people can just relate to that expression on his face. It's just a grind. Everything feels like a grind, and it just feels like, should life be like this?
And with all of the insurance and stuff added in, my monthly payment was $14.50 a month. Then my mortgage goes up, and they say, oh, the cost of...
And I'm pretty sure he works hard, which is probably why he looks tired. You know, he's somebody that probably is doing all the right things. You know, probably had, you know, very hopeful, optimistic expectations in life when he was much younger, thinking about his career. You know, I'm sure he's very successful. And yet his face, I think, represents many, many people. many people.
Materials have gone up. So in case anything happens to your house, we'd have to rebuild it. So the insurance has gone up.
Right.
And then the value of the property went up. My payment went from $1,450 to $1,740. So it went from $1,450 to now $2,500.
Wow, man.
Mortgages are on the rise. Property taxes keep going
You
up.
have to be rich. That's the only thing now. Like, you have to be rich to like have a normal life. If you don't.
Yeah, and I agree. It feels like if you want to own a home, it's a privilege. It's not something you can expect. Like, you have to be in this 0.1%. You have to be this elite person. And if you're working, you're going to get taxed horribly. So that's going to be another threat to this path to home ownership, right? So if you are somebody that, graduates from an elite university, an Ivy League university, so that, maybe it's Harvard, maybe it's Oxford, maybe it's LSE, you get a really good, well-paid job in the city. That's the kind of person where potentially they're going to be able to buy a house in the city, right? But they can certainly buy a property somewhere if they're more pragmatic about where they're willing to live. But again, that is the only type of person where they can realistically expect to have a house at a relatively young age. If you're not that person that's managed to find their way into that predicament, and again, you have to bear in mind what it takes to get into these institutions. Typically in the UK, you've got to go to a grammar school or a private school. So you've gone through paid tuition, which basically means you've lived in a postcode where house prices are high to begin with. So again, you've got to be born into a family that can afford to live in the right areas and that offer the best schools. If you think about America and the university fees there, what that takes and how expensive it is to go there. So there's all these things that need to align before you get to a point where you can think, you know what, I've got a job in an elite institution, and now I can think about a house. And everybody else is probably thinking about tenancy, renting. That's where we are now.
If you're not making a ridiculous amount of money, you are constantly just like on the brink of financial collapse.
I mean, look at this house in New Jersey. 2-bedroom, 1-bath starter home, hasn't been updated, $750,000. Let's look at the property taxes. They jumped 93% from 2024 to 2025. The property tax bill is now over $20,000.
That is strong taxes there. And that will be an annual tax. So in the UK, you might see taxes like this, but it'll be stamp duty. So it'll be a one-time transaction tax. And there may be CGT to think about as well, if it's not your main residence. But yeah, that is strong. And again, this is why renting would be a good alternative, actually, if it was regulated and cheaper. Because ownership is not necessarily the be-all and end-all. It's just the default position, because financially, at least there's predictability. So even though this figure is very, very high, broadly speaking, it's a relatively predictable figure compared to a commercial rental agreement with a landlord or a private equity landlord, certainly. And equally, you can lobby in terms of influencing this tax in terms of local government and central government as well. So you can kind of have some kind of, in theory, influence over this through your voting choices. So again, it's not that home ownership is great. It's very burdensome, actually, if you are on a mortgage, but it just is better than being exposed to the rental market. That's basically where we are.
Wow, man.
The insanity.
You gotta, the fact that you have to pay taxes to live in your house, they're taxing you for living.
Yeah, and that's a good way of summing it up. It's just a tax for being alive. And this is why I get very, very frustrated when chancellors talk about the fact that, they've got inflation under control, patting themselves on the back, and they ignore taxes. And taxes are inevitable for ordinary people. You're taxed on transactions, you're taxed on any kind of event. So if you want to pass money to your children, if your grandparents want to pass money on to you, unless you're getting married, there are restrictions on what they can do technically. So none of this stuff is actually reported. So many people won't be aware of this, but there are limits on gifts. The only transaction where it's unlimited is between married partners. But broadly speaking, other transactions, other gifting, they're all taxable. If you buy or sell a house, it's taxable subject to any reliefs. So again, if it's your main property, there'll be a relief that offsets that tax. But yeah, I mean, this is the problem. It's like just to live, you're being taxed because everything is a commercial transaction. Everything is a commodity when you live in a capitalistic free market framework. And that is why there are all these taxes. And the only way you can avoid them is if you have good lawyers, you're very, very rich, and you can create losses, and or you can take advantage of other reliefs the governments may grant you. So yeah, and that is why I consider taxes a cost of living on top of things like inflation.
In your own home is insane. It's an insane concept, right? I can understand like a one-time tax payment when you buy a home, right? Like a one-time tax payment, or if you're going to do some kind of property tax thing, it can't be this much. It can't be this much. That's insane.
It can be that much. And I think the irony here for me is that we still can't tax billionaires on their assets. Like the idea of taxing a billionaire on their assets is so offensive. It's so perverse. It's communism. It's an affront to everything we know in modern society. But at the same time, what we can do, what we are permitted to do, is tax US homeowners in this case based on the theoretical value of an essential asset that they need. So these are not things they're hoarding because they just want to have it and they're benefiting it from in a commercial way. This is something they're living in. They're not monetizing it. They're not subletting it. They're not renting out a room to cover any of this. Well, they could. Maybe that's the argument, right? Maybe that would be the counter argument to this is that, well, you have an asset, so use it as such. Don't use it as somewhere to live. Use it as something to create income. That is your obligation now.
Payment. After rent, utilities, car payment, and every other bill, how is anyone supposed to save up for a $750,000 starter home that comes with a $20,000 tax bill?
Right.
They can't.
And also, how is anyone meant to invest? So one of the big defenses Donald Trump has had in terms of the things with the economy, with the tariffs, with the war, with the Epstein files, is that the Dow Jones has gone up. And many chancellors in the UK and in Europe will also point to things like gross domestic product and an increase in certain indexes which show basically total market cap for listed companies. Now, you will only benefit from that in theory from an appreciation point of view if you have a pension. So again, it relies on you having enough money to contribute to a pension, and also investments. So again, you have enough money spare to invest in shares or stocks or securities. Now, even if you do these things, any gains that they're congratulating themselves over are all theoretical. Unless you sell those stocks, you can't realize that. And even if you do that, there'll be taxes anyway. But if you're an executive working for a Fortune 500 company or a FTSE 100 company, and your remuneration is tied to share value, so you get variable pay based on the price going up, then it does make a difference to you. So when we talk about the Americans being richer, which is something Donald Trump has talked about, and Pam Pondy, I can't remember her name, but the US district attorney, I believe, has gone on about this when challenged about the Epstein files. Realistically, they're describing executives, people that work for boards, so chief executive, chief financial officers, these kind of individuals. And this is a very small subset of individuals, earning a lot more money because they've delivered more value to their shareholders. So again, that's something else to appreciate here, I think. This idea that somehow ordinary workers are benefiting from this dynamic is in my mind a fallacy.
can't. And the reality is, for a lot of people who have bought, they're realizing that they can't afford it, so they're trying to sell. In Austin, Texas, 4.2% of homeowners are upside down. In Cape Coral, Florida.
So what she means by upside down, and it says it there, if you look at the second paragraph, is she's talking about negative equity. So this is a situation where the market value, so this is the theoretical market value of your home, if you were to sell it, is less than the outstanding mortgage, essentially. So this is essentially what would happen if you were to allow housing prices to correct, because many people, extended themselves in terms of financing in desperation to buy any kind of home just because there wasn't a lot of supply. So many homeowners will be in this situation, unfortunately. So in that situation, what you have to do is you just have to wait and hope that the value of your home goes up over and above the value of the mortgage debt that you have to pay back. Because if you sell before then, what's going to happen is you're going to sell the property, and then there may be taxes involved as well, which you have to settle. And then you're still going to have a debt that needs to be settled some other way. And obviously you want to avoid that because, in that situation, perversely, you would have been better off not buying the home, right? You've kind of gone backwards financially. So this is why negative equity is troubling and challenging. But then the other dynamic also with this situation is that it removes housing from it removes housing off the market. So it means there's actually just less houses available for people to buy, and that they are competing for those houses more aggressively. And then if you're having more economic migrants come into the country to basically address the shortfall of low birth rates, and in the UK, you do need this to cover pension costs that come out of daily tax receipts because there's no sovereign wealth fund, for example, it creates more demand for houses. And then what you will find in the UK, unfortunately, is that when people are struggling to buy houses, is that right-leaning parties will then point to the immigrants and say they're the problem. And I think for me, this is why it's really important to think very objectively about what's happening. Because to me, I would always argue that the fact that there's more economic migrants coming into Western economies, for example, is more a symptom of a deeper issue. It's not the cause. And therefore, if you have any frustrations around what you're observing and this changing face of your community, then you have to take that frustration and focus it in the right place. And the right place isn't the symptoms, right? It's not the immigrants. I have to be very blunt and strong on this point. It's what we're seeing here around this creation and hoarding of housing assets. That is the cause, in my view, as to what we're seeing and why people are now struggling for the very basic things in life.
Florida, it's 7.8%. Foreclosures are up 14% from 2024.
Ooh.
Sellers are removing their listings because they don't want to go below what they initially paid. We can see it on this listing. On Google Trends, Sell My House keeps trending, and a top related query is Sell My House fast.
Wow.
People aren't just casually listing their homes, they need out of their mortgage.
The economy got so bad, bro, we about to sell the house. The house is paid for, but there's still bills.
Yeah, and that's quite sad. And anyone that's paid off their mortgage will know what a massive moment that is. It's a fantastic achievement, and if it's something you've managed to do, you can be really, really proud of yourself. But when you see property taxes of about $20,000, $30,000 a year, and as I said, you're not renting out a room, then you're going to struggle. I mean, the only other way you could potentially think about doing it, I suppose, is to basically get another mortgage, because I believe that that property tax relates to the fact that you own the house outright. So it would actually mean, this is not financial advice. And again, you need to talk to a financial advisor about this, but maybe actually take out a small mortgage again, if it's contingent on owning the house outright. So for me, it encourages and incentivizes perverse behaviors. And as I said, what it actually starts making people think about doing is not treating houses as essential resources, but as assets, and purely as assets.
when you've already paid off your home? You've done what is supposed to be the hardest part about owning a home financially, and you still have to sell it because you can't afford to pay the fucking bills, bro. The property taxes, the water, the light bill, all these fucking data centers that they're building, sucking up all the water and the electricity, raising the cost of these utility bills. It's insane, bro.
It was $450. The water bill this month was $250. And it ain't nothing but two of us in this house.
Man.
Get a trailer, man. Go buy a little small land in Tennessee somewhere, man. We can't do this city shit no more, man. It's getting hard.
And if it's this bad for people who are still working, imagine the people on a fixed income who have retired. If a senior bought a home for $200,000, paid it off over 30 years, and that home is now valued at $2 million, they owe taxes on a $2 million asset, even though they've never owned $2 million.
Right. And that's a really good point. And this is exactly why I'm against the mansion tax, as we call it in the UK. So what the Chancellor has introduced on top of council taxes is an additional tax on houses over, I think, £2 million. Basically, it's houses that are in the millions, essentially. And the idea is that, it's a mansion tax and only the wealthiest people in society will be impacted. But again, you could find yourself as a pensioner who bought a house in a major city, when it was affordable, paid it off very, very quickly. And then now its market value is 2 million, 1 million. And you have a fixed pension, you have a state pension. What are you going to do? Are you supposed to now go back to work to cover that? Should you rent out any spare rooms to strangers? Do you downsize? Which again is, I guess, really insidiously, maybe that's what they're trying to do here. But I think for me, it feels like, what are we doing? If this is a industrialized nation, a civilized nation, civilized economies, the first world, self-proclaimed first world, then why is it that, the ordinary people that have worked hard and maybe got lucky in terms of the economic conditions they found themselves in, but that's not their own fault, done all the right things, suddenly find themselves in a situation where, at the point in time where you want to be thinking about resting, enjoying life, you've worked for 60, 40, 50 years, you've still got this massive tax burden on, and as she says, rightly so, on something that's not realized, yet we still cannot think about wealth taxes. We just cannot do that. But we can tax pensioners. And to be clear, mansion taxes will affect pensioners. More so actually in many cases than you might think, because typically they're going to be the people with houses that have appreciated in a very dramatic way and tip them into this 1 million, 2 million market value.
Right.
They're on a fixed income, and when they can't pay, the state can and does foreclose.
That's
Adults over
fucked.
65 are now the fastest growing homeless demographic in the country.
Congratulations on paying off your house. Thank you. I finally own my home. I love that for you. Now pay property taxes. For what? For owning the home. But I already paid for the home. Yes, that was for the structure and the land.
Yeah, and that's why I'm wondering, if you don't own the home and the taxes don't apply, if you don't own the home outright, do you remortgage the house or part of it? Do you release equity, right? Which is a way of basically reverse mortgage, essentially. It's not the technical term, but that's essentially what's going on when you release equity from your house. So again, for me, you have to think about loopholes, because if there's going to be a financial burden anyway, then which one has the least impact? And if having a smaller mortgage, but again, well, you're not going to get a mortgage at a pension age, are you? I've just thought about that. So that's not even an idea either. Yeah, I don't know. It's not good.
And that's rented. For who? Us. For how long? Forever. And if I stop paying, we take the house. But I bought it. Correct. And now you maintain it for us.
So you don't even own the land. You don't.
No, you don't. And this is quite common, actually. So in the UK, a lot of these new builds, are being built on leaseholds. So there's a leasehold arrangement. And this basically what it means is that the land itself that the properties have been built on are owned by a freeholder, a landowner, basically. And they are entitled to rent, for want of a better word, so lease payments for occupying that land. And typically this will be about for 150 years, 125 years in the UK, which sounds like a long time. But actually, when you think about what a house is and how long it's going to be there, and this idea that you may want to, if you die, leave it to a beneficiary, you'll quite quickly end up in a situation where that lease is under 100 years. And what you'll find in the UK, certainly, is that unless you extend that lease, it will affect negatively the value of your home. And that obviously puts the freeholder in a massively favorable position in terms of leverage. And they can basically charge quite a significant amount of money to extend the lease. And that's the problem you have with this. So you always have this indebtedness, no matter what happens with that house. So even if you pay it off, you're never financially off the hook, because you can't pick up your house and move it somewhere else very easily. It's just not possible. And it's a very ridiculous situation. And it harks back to a sort of time where the aristocracy owned all the houses and all the land, and we just lived on it at their pleasure. That's what it reminds me of. So for me, this is not what a modern civilized society should look like, in my opinion.
Own anything in this country, bro. You don't own anything. You don't even own your fucking, like, the content you consume. It's all streamed. You got to pay a monthly fee to access that shit. You don't own anything, man.
Yeah, and I think, that's the world we live in now. Ownership is becoming less and less of an idea. And I think it will become more and more normalized as generations pass. So again, if you don't know what you never had, then this subscription model, this subscription economy will feel very, very normal to you. You'll have no point of reference, right? It will just be something that your grandparents or your parents will harken on about. But from, as a new, as part of the new generation, you think about the future kids, the future children, the future generations, they may just be resigned to it. So yeah, I think for me, it's a big, big problem, because the whole premise around this was that this subscription model would be significantly cheaper because of free markets, because of competition. But at the end of the day, if the underlying asset is being hoarded and monopolized, then you're not going to see the benefits of this, competition when it comes to subscription pricing. What you're actually going to see is a subscription is almost as expensive, if not more expensive, over its lifetime than actually owning the asset. And think about what you pay every month for a Microsoft license, for example, when, not so long ago, you could just buy a disc one time, download it on your computer and maybe 5 others, and never think about that cost ever again.
You understand that? I mean, I guess we did come into this world with nothing, and I suppose we will leave with nothing, but
it'll be less than nothing, right? Because when you came into this world, you came in with no debt. And when you leave the world, you will have accrued a lot of debt if you're an ordinary person. And if you have any assets, there'll be inheritance tax. So you'll leave with less than nothing, actually. You're just offsetting it with, hopefully, an accumulation of wealth.
It's crazy. I thought while we were alive, you at least had something. You at least got the chance to own a thing. Apparently not.
So this is renting? No, this is home ownership. So what did I actually buy? A lifetime subscription with surprise price increases.
But if you can't afford a traditional home, there are alternatives, modular or manufactured homes built in a factory. It's the next layer down in the funnel. For years, this was considered a real path to affordable home ownership. Today, over 20 million Americans live in manufactured homes. There were over 26,000 shipments in the first quarter of 2025 alone. That's up nearly 8% from 2024. But the average cost of a new manufactured home is now $109,000.
We're going backwards. Don't you see that? It's 2026 now. And now we're all like, yeah, well, a trailer park doesn't sound that bad. You know what I'm saying? That's where we are.
Yeah, and in one of my more recent videos where I talked about crypto being a scam, one of the things I talked about was this disconnect between price and value. And what price often will reflect is monopolies, leverage, circumstance. And I think housing is a good example of this, actually. Certainly, because again, you think about new houses and how cheaply they're built. You're thinking about these alternatives that Vanessa here is describing. You know, Don has obviously made the point around the quality is going down, right? You know, free markets and competition and capitalism is meant to improve quality because there's always this competition for market share. That was the idea, but actually we're seeing the reverse, so which is why he's apt when he says it's going backwards. So despite it's going backwards in terms of quality and what is available to you, the price is still accelerating upwards because the overriding dynamic, is monopoly. It's demand. It's the essentialness of the thing that we're competing for. That is the thing that is being taken advantage of because there's no regulation to deal with this. So this is why, as I say, the price of something is not necessarily have anything to do with its fundamental utility or its true underlying value, if such a thing exists. And this is a classic example of that point I was raising in that video.
As a society, we're going backwards. Everything is supposed to get cheaper and easier as technology advances, right?
And again, that should be reflected in the price. So if you have these very cheap homes, and as Vanessa says, they're meant to be an alternative, and it comes back to the point I was raising before. You know, there was a time where poor man, rich man just meant poor man had a smaller, modest house, and rich man had big mansion. But fundamentally, they both had a house. And it's the same with this, right? This alternative, if it's made more cheaply, more efficiently, competition should mean it's reflected in the price. So there's no issue with the fact that this is the type of homes people are thinking about. Because even if you have a lot of money, this still might make sense to you if you have other financial goals. If you want to travel the world and take 5 holidays and put your money into nice cars or nice clothes, again, this might be a very good option for you, actually, if you're comfortable with this arrangement. But this is not what's driving these decisions, and this is why it's problematic. And it's because there's no choice. Again, the pricing is being leveraged heavily in the favor of the asset owner, and it has nothing to do with the value they're actually delivering.
That's how this shit is supposed to work. But yet now people are like, yeah, but how much for this fabricated trailer home on wheels? Yeah, this is gonna be, that's my dream home now.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, in order to cope with this, there is a sense of just self-gaslighting you have to do sometimes.
Section homes, the larger ones, are on average $164,000. But that doesn't include land. You need somewhere to put it. And just like everything else, land prices are skyrocketing. Many people place their manufactured home on a rented lot. You own.
Yeah, and for me, this is another problem because you would think that the land is owned by the government. You know, it remains a public resource, and even if there is the government would be the freeholder if it's the UK, and if there are property taxes or lease payments or rental payments, at least it's going back into the public purse to then deal with social objectives. and making sure there is a welfare state, and things like this, and good schools, good healthcare, building roads, employing civil servants, etc., and paying politicians salaries, whatever, right? That's what you would think it would happen. But what you're seeing as well is that land is also a commodity. It's also an asset, which is just, sold to the highest bidder. So a lot of land in the UK is under private ownership. And one of the biggest landlords actually is the royal family themselves, who are making a lot of money, for example, for renting out space for wind farms, for example. And that was in the news quite recently and controversially. So unfortunately, even public lands that fundamentally shouldn't really belong to anyone, in my view, is being carved up amongst the very, very wealthy. And then they're allowed to use that land to continue to extract and concentrate resources, financial resources and assets, amongst, within their own demographic, essentially. And that's what we're seeing ultimately, a more and more of a concentration of assets into a smaller and smaller demographic of individuals.
The home, but you rent the small plot of land underneath it. Just like how billionaires are buying up all the single family homes, they're also buying these manufactured home lots.
Of course.
23 private equity firms now own more than 1,900 manufactured home.
And I think you do need to pay attention to the fact this is private equity, venture capital. So as somebody who is a retail investor, for example, which would be most people, as I say, many would just argue, well, why don't you just invest then in these companies? Why don't you just invest in companies that have interests in real estate? Unfortunately, it's private equity. So what that means is that unless you are a high net worth individual that's invited to invest in a particular fund that they're managing, you don't have access to this opportunity to grow your wealth, actually. So the closest thing you may have to that is a real estate investment trust or a REIT. So you can buy a REIT where you can then see normally quite modest but predictable returns. And it's a function of what a REIT is. It has to pay out dividends, essentially. So, if you are minded to take advantage of this situation and this dynamic, the closest thing you can get to is a REIT. But this more aggressive approach that she's describing here, where essentially these monopolies are being allowed to form, again, it's restricted to those that have already. It's restricted to those that have a lot of money and a lot of assets already. So they're going to continue to hoard and leverage their positions ultimately. So again, it's not something you can even directly benefit from in this way if you're not going to be a homeowner either.
He got a notice.
Oh my God, I'm going to have a heart attack.
That his rent would be increasing to market value from roughly $600 to over $1,100.
Yeah, and this whole market value argument, if it's being decided by the person that benefits from that market value, one has to look at that quite cynically, I think.
Couldn't believe the amount of money that it's gone up. I mean,
because if market value goes down, which it could do, will they lower the rental agreement, would be my question, and I don't think they would.
Community of retirees, people with disabilities.
Moving a manufactured home costs between $5,000 and $15,000, with many of these homes being too old to actually move. So people become trapped. And when they can't pay and they need to leave, guess who buys their home? The same people who trapped them. According to investors, it's become one of the highest returning assets in real estate because of simple truth. People have nowhere else to go. But it gets worse. Clayton Homes controls over 50% of the manufactured home market, and they're owned by none other than Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway.
Of course.
Yeah, and Warren Buffett famously did not pay any federal taxes. I can't remember what year it was. Maybe it was 2018. So despite net worth of 148 billion, which will be on paper his theoretical wealth, just in the same way as, you may have a £2 million house, despite the fact you never held in your hand £2 million. You never sold the house and realized it, as Vanessa aptly described. You will be subject to property taxes if you're in the US, whilst Warren Buffett will be able to leverage losses and loss relief to avoid any potential taxes. Just because his asset portfolio is so huge he can afford basically to collateralize, use some of it as collateral against financing arrangements. So that is why they're able to do this. It's just because the size of their wealth is so massive. If their wealth was smaller, it's not something they could actually do. So it's not something you or I could do simply because we don't have enough assets.
Berkshire didn't just buy the factory, they've bought the entire pipeline.
And I think for me, this is why regulation is important, because what she's describing here screams a conflict of interest. So as I mentioned before, there's a monopoly forming in terms of all the housing stock, whether it's fabricated homes, settlements, recreational vehicles, sheds, whatever they are. It's the same private equity firms, for want of a better word, that are buying all of these things. And then what she's now describing here is that the same people that are, basically selling you the loans, basically then buying the house if you foreclose, it's all the same individuals. So you have a monopoly and you have clear conflicts of interest in terms of the ecosystem that's involved, from the financing to the acquisition to the foreclosure to the repossession, etc., etc. And there is regulation you would have thought that should deal with this. There should be anti-competition regulation that prevents monopolies from forming. There should be protections around conflict of interest as well, whereby the same person that's lending you the money is not the same person that's selling you the asset that you've borrowed, that you're using the borrowed funds to obtain. It's a very perverse situation as far as I'm concerned, but what it indicates is the closeness of billionaires with politicians, whereby they can influence them and convince them that this is in the interests of wider society because it's growing GDP, because it's creating jobs. That will be, the narrative that's being presented, and or it's creating financial products which ordinary people can invest in. So that will be the narrative that's presented, around all of this, ignoring the fact that what we're talking about is just about having somewhere to live.
Clayton builds the homes. Vanderbilt Mortgage and 21st Mortgage, both Berkshire subsidiaries, finance the loan. Home First Agency, another subsidiary, sells the insurance. And
the insurance as well, right? Which I didn't even list. Again, the conflict is I think it's literally screaming at us.
Berkshire has investments in companies that are buying.
This is some mafiosa type shit, bro.
He's right. It is. That's what I would be thinking. It is mafioso. If you think about mafias and protection rackets, I think it would look a lot like this.
They finance it, they insure it, and when people can't pay, they take it back. One company owns the entire life cycle from factory to foreclosure.
Wow.
And the points she's raising here are really, really important. And I think we do have to take time to give her a lot of credit for presenting this, because ultimately there is a sense from my perspective of confirmation bias, right? We do need to sit back and maybe fact check a lot of this stuff, and not take it at face value. And it works both ways, right? If you have a different view, I would suggest you take that same challenge, right? For me, it explains what I'm observing quite well. It hangs together. It's a coherent narrative that makes a lot of sense. But ultimately, correlation isn't causation, right? We can't be too conspiratorial about what we're seeing here. But I think the points she's raising are excellent simply because it forces us to think very carefully about this and what is going on. And it challenges the things, it asks the right questions ultimately. But that is the way to take a lot of this. These are not things that you have to take as ultimate truths, but these are certainly things that you do have to question and come to your own conclusions. And I think she's done an excellent job here. So I do want to take the time to give her credit for that.
CFPB is currently suing Vanderbilt. They allege Vanderbilt handed out mortgages knowing people couldn't pay. In one case, their own calculations showed a family of 5 would have $57 left in monthly income after the mortgage payment. Just $57, and they approved the loan anyway. So these people are going into debt for these homes, and look at what they're getting.
And so let this be your daily reminder to never buy a Clayton home. They use what they apparently call conjoleum. They tried to tell us that it was an upgraded version of linoleum. So this is particle board. This is the floor, and I'll just show you. This is literally that.
And what's shocking about this more than anything else, so we obviously understand that they're cutting corners and they're doing things as cheaply as possible. But it's not like we don't know how to build houses. Certainly, in Europe, engineering was something that basically was birthed. Modern engineering, as we know it, was birthed out of Europe, because obviously there was a lot of capital to fund and commission all of it, and all the research and all the development. That's what happens. So, and many people, when you think about less industrialized nations, so sub-Saharan Africa, India, these places that are considered third world, they know how to build houses. People, working class people in the UK, under under the sort of period of aristocracy where again they were ruled by a king or a lord, also knew how to build their own houses. It was a skill people just had because they needed it, because again it was critical. You had somewhere to live that was secure. So in terms of human endeavor, building a house, relatively speaking, is not rocket science. The methods have not fundamentally changed. Now houses are becoming smarter now, so it's integrating technology and apps and things like that. But the fundamentals of building a house, broadly for a normal house, right? This is not like a grand designs house, but a normal house has not changed. So why is it that we're struggling to build houses that can actually be safe, that are not full of mold and falling over, they're not insulated properly, and it just screams laziness, and the fact that there's this implicit understanding that they don't even have to try. But it's almost like it would be easier to just do the right thing than go out of your way and do such a bad job, because as I say, the fundamentals of the knowledge of building houses is as old as humanity in many ways. So it's a very strange predicament, I think.
This problem right here has been fixed 3 times. It's actively raining outside, like heavy thunderstorm, and this is I had to cut the power to my stove. Like I can't even cook right now.
So I was contracted to work on this mobile home. I had to replace some of the vinyl. I was surprised at what's under the vinyl. There is no plywood. There's this cardboard. And under that cardboard is the insulation. And on the side of the insulation is the sheetrock. That's something. I've never seen a structure that you live in that did.
And again, where is the regulation? Where is the consumer protection? This is clearly something that arguably I'd question if it's even safe. Because if there's not a lot of insulation, you're going to get basically dampness, or damp. You're going to get, it's going to be cold. It's going to lead to more illness. And considering how litigious America is, everybody's suing each other. I'm sure there must be a way of like suing somebody where, you're sold a house that basically is just not up to code, not up to standard, unless standards are very, very low, which I suspect that is the answer. It causes you to become ill. You can demonstrate that is the fact. And again, there's a lot of, no win, no fee lawyers or solicitors, certainly in America, because it's so litigious. I'd find it strange that, nobody has basically found themselves exposed financially for building such shoddy housing. So it is strange, unless what you do is you sign those rights away as part of completion. And maybe that's the answer.
Didn't have OSB minimum on the exterior of the structure. This is some of the cheapest stuff. This is cheap. You're living in a cardboard house.
I'm not here to shame anyone for purchasing a manufactured home, but I will shame this quality. People think they're buying an affordable housing option when in reality, just like so many products today, it's built as cheaply as possible. And
Yeah, and I think I agree with her, because I think the point I would make here is that, and it comes back to the point I was making around the fact that a cheaper house might be better, because there are many people, people with a lot of money, by the way, who would just want to live on a boat. You know, if you think about Amsterdam, for example, you know, you have boat houses, but they're just a sign of wealth basically now. But again, you might want to live on in a house. In Denmark as well, they have houses on the river, on the water. You might want to live in a caravan. So you think about the traveling community, and more widely, more generally, you know, if you think about American culture and this idea of being free, this idea of being on the road, you know, it's a you know, naturally it's a stunning country, as many places are around the world, but America has so much to offer. So you could imagine there are going to be individuals that want to see all of that, and live their life exploring where they're from, when it has so much to offer. And investing in an RV should offer you all of that, because the idea would have been, look, I can buy something, I don't have to think about a mortgage, and I'm relatively safe, and I can be free. But actually, what you're finding is that you're getting the worst on both sides, right? You're kind of getting something that is not as secure, because again, it's not as stable as an actual sedentary house, but it has all the same financial burdens as having a house. And the only reason you're in that predicament is because a house is just not available. It's out of reach. So again, for me, it as Don was saying, it's like we're going backwards and then gaslighting ourselves into thinking this is normal, this is acceptable, this is what housing and having somewhere to live should mean. It should mean it should be very, very expensive. You know, houses should be expensive. They should be very, very valuable. That's the mindset we now have.
sold at the highest possible price. When owning a traditional home is out of reach, what's left? Social media calls it van life. We need to call van life what it actually is.
But you know, it's so funny though. A lot of these people, they vote for Trump and they talk about the third world. Bro, you can't find houses like this in Jamaica. This doesn't exist.
And that's a really good point, to be honest with you, because again, you know, you think about the platform in which many of these right-leaning politicians are, you know, positioning themselves on, and there is this undertone of superiority, you know, and if that's the way you feel, and that's the way they feel, then, you know, fine. But I think for me, what you would hope is that they would do things that reinforces that feeling, i.e., ensuring that everybody in that is a citizen of the country they're leading is living in dignity, right? Because then that would reinforce that mindset and that feeling, and that positioning of our country versus other countries. But actually what you're finding is the opposite. You know, it's they want people to, well, we don't know what they want, but it seems as though we're in a situation where people's living standards and dignity are going down. They're bringing in economic migrants or taking advantage of a global, you know, labor force. And basically everybody is having a race to the bottom in terms of pay, in terms of how they're living. And all it's doing is creating wealth and value for those that own the assets, that own the businesses, and businesses are commercial assets, essentially, because again, it's a way of generating future cash flows, and it's something you can own. So again, it falls into the definition of an asset. So again, if you have a monopoly, you are hoarding commercial business assets, and therefore you have cornered the market, as they say. So, you know, it's very, very interesting that, you know, many would look to other countries and say, well, at least it's not as bad as, you know, at least our situation isn't as bad as that. But what you'll find is the haves and the have-nots, wherever they are in the world, the dynamic is the same. And there will be people, you know, in these poorer countries that are doing very, very well, because again, the dynamic exists. They're able to hoard the assets and therefore leverage that position over the rest of society and the rest of the citizens of that country. So as I say, the very, very top, in terms of economic wealth. They will all live a very similar lifestyle, a very similar existence, and the rest of us will be fighting for what's left over.
Like, if you get a home in Jamaica, that shit is made out of concrete, bro. You know, they have to be built to withstand things like hurricanes and shit like that. You know, of course, yeah, I'm sure if you go to like the slums, you can find some shit that's a little less structurally sound. But this isn't supposed to be the slums, right? What we're looking at, right?
Exactly that, and that's the point I'm making. When we think about right-leaning parties, they make it clear about how they view, their country's place in the world. And often, if there are slums and if there are problems, they will argue it's the outside immigrants and the outside elements that are bringing it into the country, right? And that's why everything's deteriorating. But the truth is, as I say, you've got to make sure you're not confusing the symptoms with the cause. And I think that's something, if you don't understand what I'm talking about when I say that, then it's something you may just need to think about.
Right here. This is what you need to understand, man. Americans, y'all are being sold a lie. Y'all are being sold a lie, man. They are robbing all of us blind living.
It's displacement. Over 480,000 Americans now live in RVs full time. That's double the 2021 figure. And the crazy part, it used to be that manufactured home production outpaced RV production by 18%, but that's no longer the case. RV production now outpaces manufactured homes by a ratio of 4-to-1. And remember Berkshire Hathaway? They own Clayton Homes and the mortgage companies. Well, they also own 3 of the largest RV brands in the US. The pattern is simple. Make traditional homes unaffordable, buy up the alternatives, and then make those unaffordable as well.
And again, what you have to consider as well, in terms of Berkshire Hathaway, is that these are companies or firms that will basically make a lot of money from managing other people's money. And the reason they're able to guarantee returns and therefore charge a high premium in terms of management fees is essentially because they're creating their own monopolies. So it's interesting. And again, these are things where, again, typically you've got to be eligible to partake, typically. So again, there may be, it might be exclusive. So some of them will be open to people when you can buy in, but many of them will actually be exclusive, and they will actually curate who the investors are. And it will be people that they know and are connected with, essentially, because it's private equity, not public.
Understand that when rent is astronomical, we will look for alternative living solutions, and they've already bought them. And as a result, RV living is becoming more expensive than living in a house.
Yeah, man.
People keep asking me how much.
It's just like how people tried to quit cigarettes by vaping, and so all the cigarette companies, they bought all the vape companies. They're like, we gonna get that money from you regardless. We don't give a fuck where you go. You're ours. Oh, you thought you were gonna duck us by living in an RV? Yeah, guess what? We own the RVs too, bitch.
It costs for us to live full-time up here in North Dakota in our RV. Rent cost is only $545 a month, and then we also have to pay for our trailer, which is part of our debt, which is $1,050 a month for that payment, and then my husband's truck payment is $1,000. Our insurance for both of our cars is $429, and our trailer insurance is $97. We also pay $60 for Wi-Fi. We pay $192 for our phones, and then $100 for subscriptions. Between food and gas, we're spending around $1,000 a month. We spend around $80 a month on laundry, which brings our total to $4,553.
I think you need to look at this number because it comes back to the point I was raising about inflation, because inflation tends to be measured on things like commodities. So when you think about in the UK, we have the consumer price index and the retail price index, and there are other measures of inflation. I can't remember the other ones, but those are the sort of 2 main ones I can recall. So again, the Chancellor in her last budget will congratulate herself. So this is the UK Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, because she kept that under control. But asset inflation is often ignored. And the argument might be, well, it's volatile, it goes up and down, etc., etc. But when you think about things that people actually need, like a house, I think it should be looked at and it should be tracked, actually, would be my philosophical argument. Because this wouldn't be a problem if wage inflation had also moved at the same pace. Because, we would expect inflation to some degree. That is how currency works. And when economies grow, you would typically expect currencies to inflate, actually. That in itself is not a problem. But you should also, and as the economy grows and GDP grows, you'd expect businesses to be in a position to pay their workers more money. Again, that is the underlying assumption with all of this. But because there's a concentration of wealth rather than a distribution of wealth, and you don't have a tax system or a regulatory system that corrects for any of that, real wages, as well as being taxed more, by the way, through fiscal drag, are actually not keeping up with housing price inflation. And it wouldn't matter if houses were not an essential critical asset. And I don't even like using the word asset. For me, I would position it as a resource. It should not be something that goes unregulated because it's so critical to the dignity of those that are driving the economic engine.
$1 a month to live in this RV.
So
To
after
live in an RV? Damn.
truck payment, the RV payment, and various expenses, $4,500 to live in an RV. I don't know about you, but that does not sound very affordable to me.
Nah, fuck that. You're better off renting.
But it's only going to get worse. Equity Lifestyle Properties now owns more than 200 RV resorts and campgrounds across the US and Canada, over 91,000 sites. They're not building these campgrounds for families to go on vacation. They're building them because people have nowhere else to go. And this isn't me speculating, this is in their own SEC filings. We believe millennial and Gen Z demographic will contribute to our future long-term customer pipeline.
Are criminals. These venture capitalists, CEOs, the people that own these fucking corporations that are buying up all of the land, buying up all the properties, forcing you to rent, raising the cost of living. Bro, they're criminals. These people are evil, man.
Then go on to talk about a study, and the conclusion of the study was that demand from millennial and Gen Z would continue to
all we can do is just sit back and watch?
And it's interesting that this paper, so this is the management discussion, which I'm assuming is in the financial accounts, is specifically calling out younger generation and millennials, those that don't know a different world, right? So if you're born into an economic system, everything else is just a story. It's just rose-tinted glasses. It's just a time that like the older people talk about. So it's very interesting actually that their target market is the new people, the ones that are basically innocent. They have no idea what home ownership actually meant before they were born.
Bro, no. How is this possible? We got to be able to do something about this. We got to be able to do something about this, man. Like, this is insane.
Pace supply for manufactured home and RV communities. It then goes on to say, the entitlement process to develop new manufactured home and RV communities is extremely restrictive. As a result, there have been limited new communities developed in our target demographic markets.
And another point is that if the government just built more homes, it would literally disrupt all of this. and that's another irony here. This strategy would be threatened by the simple act of just building more homes. And again, if this is truly a capitalist free market economy, that competition should exist. It should be encouraged, actually. So the fact that it's being said with such confidence would suggest that they are banking on the idea that not enough homes are actually going to be available or be built. And if they are built, they're going to remain unaffordable, actually. And it might even get to the point where it might make sense to no longer, and this is from an economic position, not from one that's sensible or responsible from a societal point of view, where it makes more sense to just abandon the idea of a traditional home, just stop building them, because there's a lot more profit to be made by making RVs and manufactured houses and fabricated houses and repurposed sheds, building those instead, and making those available to people because the margins are much better. They're quicker to erect. There's less burden in terms of build quality, and nobody has a choice anyway. So again, it's a very strange predicament we're seeing here. And the implications, and again, I could just be adding 2 and 2 and getting 5 here in terms of how I'm interpreting what she's suggesting here, which is why, as I say, it's important you do your own research and think about this for yourself and form your own opinion. But again, it's hard to not think conspiratorially around all of this. It's hard not to read into the patterns, and which is why this video she's created is so compelling, and why it works. Actually, it's a really good video, but her job is not here to tell us what to think. Her job is to present her narrative, which I personally find very compelling.
When everything becomes unaffordable, you get people buying storage sheds from Home Depot and converting them into homes.
Yeah.
That's how desperate things have gotten.
And they're proud of it, and they should be, because, they're not taking this shit lying down. They're not giving up on life. They're saying, fuck it, I'm gonna make something work some way, somehow. But this is not the American dream that I heard about when I was moving to this country, 16, 17 years ago. Like, this was not the American dream. The American dream, I wasn't coming to America so I could live in a fucking shed. Hell fucking no. What the fuck?
Yeah, and I think for me, it comes back to this point around, well, there's nothing wrong with living in a shed if that's what you want to do. And for many people, it will be something they want to do, actually, if it gives you that financial freedom. I think the problem we have here is that you have to take the shed and you don't have the financial freedom. So it's not this alternative that Vanessa has been talking about here. So I think for me, that's ultimately the problem. And that's why it's arguably quite frustrating for many people.
I did not move to America so I could live in a shed that I got from Home Depot, bro. But the crazy part is, it's Americans born and raised in America that's what they doing. That's what they gotta do. Shit is fucked up. You used to be able to be a mailman and raise a family. You used to be able to work for the federal government as a mailman. Your wife doesn't even have a job. You have 2 kids. You bought a home. You got a dog, a fence, a backyard, all of that. And you could, take your family out to eat at a diner after Sunday church sermon. Now you got to be a neurosurgeon to fucking do that shit.
Yeah, and I think the problem is that won't even work, right? So there's a number of things that he mentioned there. So it is true, I do recall a time where, you could do these kind of jobs and, think about having a house, think about raising a family. And again, the only difference would have been that, if you had a lower paid job, your house was more modest. And if you had a higher paid job, you had more luxuries, essentially. But fundamentally, you still had access to a house. You still had access to good education, certainly in the UK and in Europe. And I think this is understood actually still in many Scandinavian countries as well, where even if you're doing these sort of more lower paid jobs, when you think about, being a postman or a post lady, or, working in the catering industry, working as a civil servant, or someone in the public sector, a teacher, it's understood that you still need to be paid well because these jobs still need to be done. And it actually enables and ensures that you have these communities that are preserved and retained. So when you think about a lot of the observations those on the right are making, and conservatives and those with conservative values are making, and more conventional and traditional values, which are apparently being eroded away, one has to question, how can you expect to preserve all of these things if you don't have an economic environment that is conducive to communities being formed and being preserved? Because as I say, many people in this country, many young people, are going to look at this situation and just say to themselves, you know what, I didn't sign up for this. I'm going to apply my trade in a different country where my money goes further. I'm not going to even think about having kids because, you know, I don't need more financial burdens or problems to deal with. And then those that these jobs still need to be done, and there's still value that needs to be created and transferred over to business owners. So what they're going to do is take advantage of the global workforce, and that's why you're going to see more economic migrants. So again, this is why when I talk about symptoms and causes, it's important that you have an understanding as to where your frustrations, if you have any, may lie. What often is happening is that we're being pointed in the direction of the symptoms, and that is what's creating a lot of division. When actually it's better, as Vanessa Wingard is trying to do here, is try and understand what may be causing these things. And this will be a thesis she's presenting. This is a narrative. Her job is to present, you know, her narrative and ask the questions for us to think about and ponder separately. And that's why this particular video that she's created, in my view, is very valuable and very compelling.
Here's one on Home Depot's website right now. A build-it-yourself kit, 10 by 12 feet, $3,343. It's clearly a shed, but look at the description.
The way she dropped that, clearly a shed. And she's right. We can't gaslight ourselves into thinking otherwise.
How much for a spool of rope?
Whoa, 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 whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a dark one. That's a very, very dark one.
Yeah, if I get to that point, bro, where it's like this is all, I'm like, actually, I bet you a spool of rope is way cheaper. I'm fucking with you. I'm playing, but I'm just saying, shit is dire, bro.
Windmere
Yup, it is dire.
Has shed DNA, but begs to be more than a storage shed. They know exactly who's buying these and what they're doing with them. And the reviews confirm it. People are converting these into tiny homes.
5 stars! Oh my God, I love my shed home. I love it. It's so spacious.
It's the new affordable option.
And the funny thing is that, you know, it could be something that disrupts the housing market. It could disrupt this monopoly. But because you won't really, so in the UK, you couldn't just buy a shed and live in it because there'd be regulations, there'd be planning permission, it would have to meet certain you know, environmental codes, you know, so there will be building codes that need to be met, for example. So, you know, it will need a power supply. So again, it will need to have you know, a proper electrician connect it to the grid. So, you know, there'll be all sorts of things that prevent people from actually just building their own home. But if you could just build your own home, that would solve a lot of problems, actually. And it would threaten, you know, this current position where we have this monopoly over home ownership, because it's something we all need. So it's just interesting that, you know, we're kind of joking about the fact that people are co-opting sheds and pretending they're houses, and they're, you know, they're actually being used as houses. But in many ways, the philosophy of just having that freedom to build your own house, even if it's a very simple one, provided you're willing to take that risk and learn the skills. And I think it's something you could learn, and it would be a useful thing to learn, to be honest with you. You know, it could be the very answer that we need.
And they're now building these sheds to look more like house than shed.
Right.
They come with windows.
Because they know. They're like, people are living in these. Let's stop even calling them sheds. Let's call them, I don't even know. They're going to change the name of them. They're not going to be called sheds for much.
Yeah, but if you stop calling them sheds, then they're going to be priced. They're going to not be priced as sheds. They're going to be priced as something akin to a house. So that's the thing here. And there is this saying in the UK whereby if you're going to get married, don't tell any of the suppliers or vendors you're going to get married. Just tell them you're having a party, you're having a gathering. Because if you tell them you're going to get married, there's this premium you're going to have to pay over and above the normal going rates for just organizing an event. And I think there's similar sort of dynamic will happen, and there'll be a similar sort of psychology that would happen if they start positioning these sheds as makeshift houses.
Longer.
Upstairs, side.
You know, that has a stigma to it. so they got to call it something else, right? They can't call it something so that you don't think you can use it as a shed, but they don't want you to think you got to use it as a shed either.
Being the works. Looking at this, it made me wonder, is private equity involved in the shed industry?
Of course.
And I don't know why I thought the answer could be anything other than, of course they are. Cyprium Partners made a $30 million investment in backyard products.
Nice.
And by 2017, their COO was bragging that they were producing more storage sheds than anyone in North America. And he specifically noted that accessory dwelling units were an emerging category. Even in 2017, they noticed
they're going to start buying up the tent market. You know, like tents that you go camping in? Yeah. They're just pushing people further and further closer to the brink of just living in tents. And then they're going to buy up the tent market as well.
people converting these sheds into living spaces and thought, let's capitalize on that.
Yeah, and they still got the land as well. So obviously they own a lot of the land, as well as all the tents and the sheds and the fabricated houses and the conventional or traditional houses. You know, I guess can we live in trees, or the tree houses, are they safe? I mean, what's left? I guess it's a madness.
That Home Depot shed I just showed you, it's one of 7 brands owned by Backyard Products, the same company that received private equity backing. Billionaires are buying up every affordable housing alternative, things that arguably shouldn't even count as alternatives in the first place. So what are people supposed to do? Be homeless? No, because the Supreme Court made that illegal in 2024.
Vicious.
And again, this is where, we have to be very careful, because it's hard not to look at something like this as a big conspiracy. Because if you're in a situation where you have to live somewhere, and by doing so, you indebt yourself, you become indebted to the person that owns the underlying resource. And again, it's the same as she was mentioning with Berkshire Hathaway. In that particular example, it's the same individuals indirectly that have a holding or a shareholding in the finance product. They have a shareholding in the thing you're buying with that debt. They have a stake in the insurance. They also benefit from the foreclosure. They've also monopolized the market as well. So you're in a situation basically where it's conspiring against you, whether intentionally or not, but I would argue it is intentionally, and that is the narrative we're being presented here, to basically continually extract resources, financial resources and wealth from yourself and concentrate it in those that have invested in these financial vehicles, these private equity firms, and as I mentioned, the real estate investment trusts. So, you're going to quickly find yourself in a situation where if you don't find a way of making money from these assets you've acquired, so to speak, if that's how we're going to treat them, then basically you're continually indentured to those that you have a debt to repay. And in America, if it's illegal to be destitute, it's illegal to not be housed, then what's going to happen, because the jail system and the prison system is also privatized and it's been cornered by private equity, you're going to become economically productive in jail. You're going to work as part of your time in jail. So ultimately, the implication is you must remain economically productive. That is the way you justify your existence in an economic, civilized, apparently advanced economy. That is what you have to do. And the only way to break out of this, as Don was mentioning, is that you just have to become rich enough to sit on the other side of this fence and be part of that ruling class that gets to basically hoard assets and get everybody else to continually remain indebted to you. Like that, those are the two options you fundamentally have.
It's illegal to be homeless, to be unhoused. It's illegal. They made it illegal to be broke, but if you're broke and you own a home, then that's illegal as well. They're going to take it from you. Bro, we live it. This is some evil shit, man. I would rather live under like a king in the old times. That like feudalism. That sounds.
But it's just almost like the end game of capitalism. Like that's what this is. Because he's right. You know, I do agree with him. It's not. It doesn't feel like we're creating value here, right? It feels like basically you're just leveraging, which is basically how business works, right? You leverage your commercial, power, I suppose. You leverage your market share. That's what business is. But it feels broken ultimately, which is the sentiment I'm getting from him, and I do agree with that sentiment. It just feels wrong, and there's no that's not an objective observation. That's an emotional one, I suppose, and a subjective view. But it does just feel wrong.
Better.
So then it's the for-profit prisons, the $4 billion industry where private equity is already running the phones, the food, and the healthcare.
Yeah.
That's
all of this is just a pipeline to create slaves, right? You're a wage slave, but then when the wages from your wage slave job isn't paying you enough and you get evicted from your home, now you're unhoused. That's illegal. So they capture you and put you in prison, and then.
And the language being used here is very emotive. You may feel like the word slave is an exaggeration or too strong. But to be honest with you, I'm personally comfortable with how this is being presented by Don, because the reason I say this is because what business in my mind should be is where there's a fair exchange of value. That's the idea behind it, whereby you have two relatively equal parties who are transacting with each other, and there should be mutual benefit, because otherwise there's no incentive for either party to enter into that agreement fundamentally. Otherwise it's not an agreement, it's coercion, it's something else. So in that dynamic, even though arguably your employer will have, if you are employed, will have more negotiating power. And even if you are self-employed, for example, or even if you have your own business, it's likely to begin with anyway, your clients will have more leverage than over you, then, and therefore have that leveraging or that power. It should still be mutually beneficial, because otherwise, what is the point? And if you are somebody that's employed, you have gone through a selection process, you have gone through a recruitment process, and therefore it would imply that that business does need your services, because otherwise, why would they employ you? They might as well think about an AI agent or just not employ anyone, right? So the fact that it's not a charity, it's basically what I'm saying. So in that situation, is it unreasonable to expect that as a result of that, you yourself can also enjoy the fruits of your labor, get some assets for yourself, think about, building up a pension for yourself. Once you've paid off a house, if you've managed to get one, you can think about keeping it. But actually, it just seems as though the dynamic is one where you're only paid enough, because again, wages are not increasing in line with asset prices, to simply subscribe to things and have this feeling of ownership, but not really owning anything. And those assets remain free to be accumulated by those who already have a lot of assets and don't need assets, right? So you don't have access to essential things, and the people that have what they more than enough are accumulating things because even though they don't need them, so it's a very strange dynamic. And in that dynamic, where you're not really, it doesn't feel equitable, is basically where I'm coming to on this. And if it doesn't feel equitable, then this idea of a slave master dynamic to me feels actually appropriate. So although the language is very emotive, I don't actually have a problem with it in this context.
Force you to work, and now you're working essentially as literally a slave for pennies per hour. That's what all.
And bear in mind, there are literally modern day slavery legislation whereby, companies like Apple, big global companies, I'm talking about Apple because it just comes to mind, but, be any company you can think of, they need to provide comfort and assurances around their supply chain. Nike's a good example where it's anything involving manufacturing, basically, to ensure that, they're not, nobody in their supply chain is employing child laborers, for example, and that they have good working conditions. So, although again, this language is very emotive, it's not inappropriate when you consider the context around how global business is done, the legislation around it, because they're not just being trusted to do the right thing, right? Legislators have stepped in to say, look, you must at least attest to the fact that you're not employing slaves. And also in the UK, there is a minimum wage as well. So again, these are all things that have been put in place to make sure, in some sense anyway, that the relationship between the worker and the employer is equitable. And this is why unions are really powerful as well. So the fact that you're not allowed to unionize in many companies undermines this leverage and this balance that may exist between the worker and the employer in the favor of the employer.
This is for really
bottom of the funnel.
It's a place for someone to live in full time for months or years at a time, where they live in a recreational vehicle, in an RV. This is a business I've been in for about 7 years. They have very small RV parks out there that are 3 to 10 pad sites that are about 3 to 10 times more profitable than buying a single family home as a rental. So I don't understand why people buy single family homes, because like buying a small RV park costs the same, but is significantly more profitable.
Yeah, and I think for me, I can understand why he's come to this conclusion, certainly as a younger guy, and anyone of, that kind of age or younger, because implicitly this is what the messaging is, right? The fundamental purpose in my mind of a home is to provide shelter, is to provide dignity, is to provide comfort, and ensure that you remain productive economically and also in other aspects of your life. That is its fundamental purpose. But the dynamic and the structure that we now live in is one where we're treating homes as assets and commodities primarily. And this other use I'm describing is secondary to that. So if you're in a situation where there's only two options, one is you want to use a house as a house, but that means you live in a situation where you're worried about what your mortgage is going to look like in the next 5 years or 2 years, or you're worried about what the rent is going to look like each year. You're in this massive amount of debt as well. So you have to take on a lot of debt in order to buy the house if you have a mortgage. And it basically ties up a lot of your cash. So you can't invest, you can't think about a pension, you can't go traveling, you can't do a lot of the things you want to do. If you want to have kids, you can't have kids. Or you say, you know what, I buy into the game. I play the game, and I understand that if I buy this property, or this land, I'm not buying it for the purposes of living in it. I'm buying it as a way of becoming wealthy. That is why I'm buying it. So this is the situation we find ourselves in, where houses are not houses, RVs are not RVs, sheds are not sheds. And I did talk about this point, actually, funny enough. Again, it makes me think about the video I did around crypto being a scam, where there was a discussion around the fact that, something's intended use is objective. And my argument was its intended use is subjective, and it depends on circumstances, and it depends on ingenuity, and it depends on the imagination of the individual. So if we can imagine sheds are now houses, if we can imagine recreational vehicles are now houses, then, and we're going to use them in that way. And not only that, we're going to monetize, we're going to actually generate cash from them in this way, because we're leveraging this lack of housing supply. This is a clear example of something having one use if you treat it as an essential resource. But if you think of it as a financial vehicle, a financial asset, its use gets co-opted and it does something completely different. And it no longer is there to ensure that there's enough houses for people to live in.
That is evil. Like, just that's how you're thinking.
Well, then
it's like, yeah, let's go buy a small RV park so that we can take advantage of the poor and struggling.
Yeah, and I don't think it's that simple, to be honest with you, as I've just mentioned, because I do understand the sentiment of where he's coming from, and I do kind of agree with it. But I think for me, because the problem is the people that are benefiting from this the most, that's essentially what is kind of going on, because they don't need to do it, right? But the guy we're looking at here, that previously spoke, I don't know who he is, this younger guy. We don't know his background. We don't know anything about him. But the reason why I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt is because in my mind, is probably somebody of this demographic where he doesn't even have the option to buy the house. So you have to remember this 87% that Vanessa Wingard talked about of people that don't earn enough to buy a house in the country they were born in. So if he was maybe thinking about buying a house in a country where the cost of living is cheaper, then sure. Or if he was thinking, okay, I live in the city and I want to live miles away from my friends and my family, sure, maybe he can buy a house depending on what he does. But I think the truth of the matter is it's not inconceivable based on those metrics she gave us that maybe he buying a house is not even an option for him, and he's not willing to consider living in a shed or a recreational vehicle or whatever, and actually he's just going to play the game, because ultimately as individuals we can't change the game. You can only play the cards you're dealt, and maybe this is what's going on here, and that's why I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt, where whilst more generally I do agree with Don in the sense that if we're describing billionaires who really do not need this, they're living in excess already, then yes, I would argue that's more on the spectrum of being evil and selfish.
Yeah, it is what it is, though. You know what I'm saying? That's the fucked up part. We all still gonna play the game.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree. We just, unfortunately, if you're somebody who is on that path, your main, income that comes through employment, you're kind of in a situation where you've got to play the game, and it's only through political action you can consider doing something else, in theory, right? So yeah, it is what it is, as he says.
We all gonna still try to get rich because it's that or die. They used to be get rich or die trying. Now it's get rich or die.
Yeah, that's basically what it is, which is why what that guy was saying about, taking an RV or a park or whatever it was he was describing and using it to basically generate an income. That's why I think he was saying what he was saying. You don't have, it's very binary. There's nothing in between. It's either you stay poor or you stay relatively poor anyway, and you stay on this economic treadmill, constantly having to find ways of paying taxes or paying back amounts you borrowed. And if you can't do so in America, certainly you go to jail and you've got to find a way of being economically productive there. Or you become rich enough to play the other game of hoarding assets and ensuring that other people, have to basically borrow those assets off you, essentially. Those are basically the two options you have.
Yeah, that's where we're at now. But hey, you let me know what you...
Yeah, so for me, this was a really thought-provoking and really good video, and that's why I wanted to cover this, because there's two aspects of it I really enjoyed. So the actual original video by Vanessa Wingard, I'd very much recommend you watch that, and as I said, I'll leave a link to that video in the comments, as well as this particular video I'm reacting to by Young Don in the comments as well. And I think for me it brings together a lot of different things that we've been observing. So obviously one of them being around the fact that there's this normalization of houses being very expensive and unattainable now, rather than something, when you think about what it is, you know, it's just an essential resource that should be accessible to everybody. And actually the only differences we should be observing is basically, okay, if I'm not so successful, maybe my house is more modest, and if I'm more successful, then maybe I get to live in the location I want to live and my house is much bigger. But ultimately everybody gets to live in a house, and gets to, you know, have that dignity. You know, we can see again this disconnect between, you know, what a house has to offer and the price you're expected to pay. Because again, as Vanessa Wingard, you know, really demonstrated really well, there is this monopolization of the housing sector and also the supply chain, so to speak, in terms of financing to buy housing, insurance, and that ecosystem, and more broadly speaking. So again, it's something that I think has wider impacts in terms of people's decisions to stay in the country and or become expats or become digital nomads, thinking about whether or not they're going to have children, how productive they are at work if they're stressed at home, and also the impact and the need for economic migrants to fill that labor gap, essentially, because the population is aging, for example. So I think for me, it's a really interesting video. And I think for me, you know, it gives us a lot to think about separately. And as I say, it's always important, you know, whether you have confirmation bias on this or it's something that challenges your own thoughts, that you do think about this objectively and form your own views. But yes, not very hopeful in terms of what's been outlined here, but ultimately I think it's something that, you know, if you do feel strongly about it, you know, maybe it's something, you know, to think about in terms of you know, what you do in terms of political decisions you're making, for example, and maybe some, you know, the financial decisions you're making as well. But hopefully you found that useful. But until next time, peace.